Nobody could talk Ruth Anderly out of it. Not her father. Not the buyer standing in the driveway with cash already counted out. Not even her own tears, which came anyway, quiet and unwanted, while she held the halter rope tighter. "She's not for sale," Ruth said. She was 13 years old, and the cow standing beside her, an aging Jersey named Marigold, was the last dairy animal left on a farm that had once milked 40 head twice a day. The buyer, a cattle broker from 2 counties over, looked at Dale Anderly like he expected him to overrule his daughter. Dale didn't. He just stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, and said nothing at all. If quiet stubbornness and the wisdom hidden in ordinary things move you, subscribe and join us every week. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Anderly Farm sat in the rolling hill country of southern Wisconsin, dairy country by tradition, if not by present-day economics. Ruth's grandfather had built the herd from nothing in the 1960s, and by the time Ruth was born, the farm was milking 40 jerseys twice a day, shipping cream to a co-op that had served 3 generations of families in the valley. But dairy farming had gotten harder every year that Ruth could remember. Margins thinner, feed costs higher. The co-op itself finally closing its doors the year Ruth turned 11, unable to compete with consolidated industrial operations 2 states away. Dale had sold off the herd in pieces after that, 38 cows over 18 months, keeping only enough hay ground and pasture to switch mostly into beef cattle and corn, a decision that made financial sense on paper even as it broke something in him that he never talked about. Ruth's mother, Denise, had passed 3 years earlier, cancer that moved faster than anyone expected, and it was Denise who had loved the dairy operation most of all, who had named every cow, who had spent early mornings in the parlor humming old hymns while the machines ran. Marigold had been Denise's cow specifically, the one she'd bottle-raised by hand after a difficult birth, the one she'd always said had more personality than half the people in town. When Dale started selling off the herd, Ruth had asked, quietly and only once, if they could keep Marigold. Dale had said yes, mostly because saying no to his grieving daughter about one single cow felt like a cruelty he didn't have room for on top of everything else. For 2 years, Marigold grazed alone in the smaller back pasture, mostly forgotten, an expensive sentimental gesture that produced nothing but milk nobody needed and hay bills nobody wanted. Ruth milked her by hand every morning before school anyway, a habit that had started as grief and become something closer to devotion. It was Ruth's grandmother, Opal, who still lived in the farmhouse's back bedroom, who noticed the pattern first. Opal was 76, sharp as a tack despite 2 hip replacements, and she'd lived through enough agricultural cycles to recognize warning signs most people missed. She subscribed to 3 farm trade publications and read every one cover to cover, underlining passages in red pen, and it was Opal who first mentioned, almost offhand at dinner one evening, that supply chain disruptions were hitting dairy processing plants harder than the news was really covering. Ruth had listened the way she listened to everything Opal said, carefully, filing it away without fully understanding why it mattered yet. The trouble that made all of it matter arrived that winter, when an ice storm knocked out power to half the county for 9 days and a fire at the region's largest dairy processing plant, 200 miles away, shut down nearly a third of the area's fluid milk supply overnight. Grocery store shelves emptied fast. Local news ran segments about milk shortages that seemed almost absurd in dairy country, in a state whose license plates literally advertised itself as America's Dairyland. But the shortage was real, driven by a processing bottleneck that had nothing to do with how many cows were actually out in the fields. Dale mentioned it at dinner one night, more amused than concerned, the way people talk about a strange news story that doesn't touch them directly. Ruth didn't say anything at the table, but the next morning, she started milking Marigold twice a day instead of once, and she asked her father if she could use the old, mostly unused milk house, still standing, still equipped, though nothing had run through it in 2 years, to start bottling small batches for anyone in town who wanted fresh milk directly. Dale thought it was a nice idea and a mostly pointless one. One cow produced maybe 6 gallons a day at most. That wasn't going to solve a regional shortage. It doesn't have to solve it, Ruth said. It just has to help the people close enough to reach us. Here's what Ruth understood, and what most of the adults around her hadn't quite put together yet. The shortage wasn't really about total milk supply. Wisconsin had plenty of cows and plenty of milk. It was a distribution and processing bottleneck, a broken link in a chain that stretched across hundreds of miles. Small, local, direct-to-consumer sales, the kind of arrangement dairy farms had run on for generations before industrial consolidation, sidestepped that broken link entirely. It didn't need trucks driving milk 200 miles to a processing plant and then back out to stores. It just needed a cow, a bottle, and a customer close enough to drive over. She spent the first week figuring out the legal side. Wisconsin, like most states, allowed limited direct raw milk sales under certain conditions, and Opal, digging through one of her old trade publications, found the specific regulations that applied to a farm their size. Ruth filled out the paperwork herself, at the kitchen table, checking every box twice. The first attempt at selling milk went poorly. She'd posted a handwritten sign at the end of the driveway and gotten exactly one customer in 4 days, an elderly neighbor who mostly bought out of pity. Ruth realized, after that slow week, that nobody in town actually knew the farm was doing this. She rebuilt her approach, printing simple flyers on the school's library printer and posting them at the grocery store, the gas station, and the church bulletin board, listing hours and a phone number. The second attempt brought a few more customers, but the milk house's old refrigeration unit, untouched for 2 years, kept failing intermittently, spoiling half a batch before Ruth caught the problem. A compressor that needed replacing entirely, not just cleaning. Dale, watching his daughter's frustration mount, finally stepped in without being asked and helped her source a used commercial-grade unit from a shuttered restaurant supply auction 2 towns over, the two of them installing it together over a long Saturday. By the third week, with the refrigeration finally reliable and word slowly spreading through town, demand outpaced what Marigold alone could produce. Ruth was selling out within hours of opening the milk house each morning. A small but steady line of neighbors driving out to the farm for fresh milk they couldn't find on grocery shelves. Opal, watching from the porch one morning as cars lined up along the driveway, turned to Dale and said the thing neither of them had quite said out loud yet. Might be time to think about a second cow. Dale didn't answer right away. He'd sold 38 cows over 18 months, told himself it was the only sensible choice. And here was his daughter, running a functioning dairy operation out of one animal he'd almost let go himself. By February, the Anderlys had bought back 2 jerseys from a neighboring farm that still kept a small herd, and Ruth was managing a genuine, if modest, direct-sale dairy operation, milking, bottling, and selling 3 cows' worth of milk to a steady customer base that had grown almost entirely by word of mouth. The regional shortage eased within 2 months as the damaged processing plant came back online, but by then Anderly Farm's small dairy operation had built something the shortage alone hadn't created, a loyal customer base that preferred buying direct, and a reason for Dale to look at the empty barn stalls differently than he had in years. A local reporter, hearing about this shortage cow from a neighbor, came out to do a small feature that ran in the regional paper that spring. The story mostly focused on the practical angle, supply chains, direct sales, agricultural resilience. But the closing quote was Ruth's, and it was the one line most people in town remembered afterward. "She wasn't just my mom's cow," Ruth told the reporter. "She was proof that something small can still matter, even when everyone's decided it doesn't." Wendell Berry once wrote that a good farmer is a farmer of the whole farm, hills, streams, wild groves, and pasture land, everything that lives on it. Ruth hadn't set out to prove anything about agricultural economics or supply chains. She'd set out to keep one cow because her mother had loved her, and because letting go of that last living connection felt like a second loss she wasn't ready to carry. What she found instead was that the thing she'd kept out of grief turned out to matter for reasons that had nothing to do with cinnamon at all. Ruth is 15 now. The Anderly dairy herd has grown to 6 cows, still small by any commercial standard, but steady, profitable in its own modest way, and entirely hers to manage. Opal still reads her trade publications every morning, underlining passages in red pen, and Ruth still checks them with her over breakfast most days. Dale has started talking, tentatively, about rebuilding the old milking parlor properly instead of running everything out of a converted milk house. And Marigold, older now, slower, still grazes in the same back pasture where she's grazed for years, though she's no longer alone. What's something you almost let go of that turned out to matter more than you expected? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And if stories like this one mean something to you, subscribe. We'd love to have you along.